This is my tiny tool because I couldn't find the large one. I think the wife's been hogging it. In America, this is known as a wrench. Hello, I'm Lawrence, and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond, and one of those memos pertains to moving. And the big news in my life is that I recently moved myself. That's not to say I moved myself, I took a lift ride. But I've moved apartments. And during this entire process, I've picked up some new words as well as remembering some old ones. That's to say that the United States of America, where I moved to a dozen years ago, has its own lingo when it comes to moving. But worry not, because I, Lawrence Brown, a British man, had some of my own terminology shipped over from England. That's to say I remembered it. And so without further ado, let's take a look at some of those British versus American word differences when it comes to moving. To let. Now, I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. A lot of Americans have told me over the years, Lawrence, when I visited Britain, I saw these signs everywhere that said, to let on them. What does that mean? And the truthful answer is, I've no idea. I, like most people, misread it as toilet, right? That's probably why the phone boxes always smelled of wee. That is, I didn't know what it meant until I looked it up. It's from the point of view of a landlord when he or she puts a property on the market. That's why when a tenant such as myself rents out the apartment, that's called subletting. And here's the secretive part. Both terms do exist in America. I was expecting to find some unusual term that I'd never heard of before. I think the difference is, in America, they don't emboss it all over billboards like they do in Britain. And that's why American phone boxes / phone booths don't smell of wee. But that's also because America doesn't really have them anymore, and when it did, I bet they didn't smell of wee, and if they did, they hid it really well in the movies. Either way, both countries do have the phrase to let, and undoubtedly, if Americans are anything like me, they used to insert it into a well-known shaving jingle. To let, the best a man can get. When moving, the sensible thing to do is to hire a really huge vehicle. Colloquially, both countries might use the term moving van, but Brits might draw the line at moving truck. And that's because to us, a truck is very specifically a type of vehicle that has an open top to it. In the American sense of a moving van, we'd probably call that a moving lorry, or just a lorry for short. Coincidentally, my nickname as a kid was Lorry, so you could argue that in moving apartments, I myself was a moving lorry. Come to think of it, I do have a great engine, lots of space in here, but no glove compartment, because I don't know what that would mean. But in the US, the type of vehicle that we're talking about, say a U-Haul truck, is technically known as a box truck or box van. And this is where things get confusing, because in Britain, a box van is a type of railway freight vehicle. And it's my belief that nobody should transport their goods and possessions via train, unless both of your houses happen to be situated next to train stations, in which case you have bigger problems than I can help you with. I did touch on this a couple of videos ago, but I've inhaled paint fumes since then. Not recreationally, it just comes as part of the process. And that thing is the terminology of decorating. One of the first steps involves something that I mentioned the other day, and that is spackling. To do that, you have to use what some Americans call spackling paste, and what I've been calling a spackle whacker. In America, spackling paste was originally a brand name, but it was a word so brilliant that it fell into general use. That doesn't mean that all Americans use this term, however. I discovered this week that some refer to it, though it's not quite the same thing, as mudding, as in to mud the walls, which really makes you question the structural integrity of American homes. But the nearest British equivalent of this is called polyfiller. Either way, we filled another knowledge gap. Once all of that's done and you've sanded down the walls, you're ready to paint. But here's a word of advice from a long-time interior designer with 2 weeks experience such as myself. Make a note of whether or not your walls are made of drywall. Initially, if you're British, there might be some confusion here because back home we prefer the term plasterboard. In some respects, it could depend on how old your house is as to whether or not you have drywall. As a matter of fact, the age of the house could determine the type of house and the terminology that you use to describe it. At this time, while I take a break to go and do some grouting, I'm going to hand you over to pre-pandemic Lawrence to walk you through some of the differences, and I'll be back in just a moment to talk about my toolbox, definitely not a euphemism. It wouldn't be Britain and America if they weren't two countries separated by a common language, and the same is true of the housing world. So let's finish with a rapid fire round looking at those very words. So here in Chicago, I live in a flat, except in America they don't call it flat, it's called an apartment. Something else that you'll find in America though are these condominiums or condos, if you don't fancy saying a word that has condom in it. And we do have those in Britain. They're usually called common hold properties, and I suppose most British people wouldn't go around using that term, whereas you actually hear the term condo quite a lot. It's been suggested to me that I move into a condo, and it sounds good. I mean, when I first heard the term, I thought it sounded like I might be moving onto a lakeside boat or something like that. It is like an apartment, but it's one you would buy. It's real estate. Now, as a child and young adult, I grew up in a house that was known as a semi-detached house. That's when you have a house adjoined to one other house on one side, but not on the other side. In the United States, this is known quite simply as a duplex, which is not a wrestling move. If it is adjoined on both sides with another house, then you are part of a line of houses that are known as terraced houses in Britain. In America, they're known as row houses because they're all in a row, presumably. Then there's council housing in Britain versus the projects in the United States, and that's just another way of saying public housing. I showed you this earlier but forgot to mention that British people don't call this a spackle whacker, nor do Americans. It's just me. It could be known here as a spackle knife or a putty knife, but in Britain it's called a scraper. Don't use these on your windscreen/windshield. Occasionally when you're putting together new furniture like a bookshelf or a throne, you might have to give it a good screw. Both countries do of course use the term screwdriver. The big difference comes when you're tightening a bolt. This is my tiny tool because I couldn't find the large one. I think the wife's been hogging it. In America, this is known as a wrench. In Britain, we're not satisfied with a monosyllabic word. We use spanner. And finally, perhaps the most important tool in my box is this. A utility knife. In America, it's very common to hear one of these referred to as a box cutter because it cuts boxes. And in that respect, it certainly beats your hands in more ways than one. You have to appreciate my cutting humour. But both countries take it a step further and rely on branding. In Britain, I was always used to a good old Stanley knife. Stan Lee admittedly sounds like the creator of the X-Men, whereas the American equivalent sounds like one of the mutants. It's called an X-Acto, and it's a poor man's Wolverine. That's it! Ow! That's it for this episode of Lost in the Pond. Thank you for joining me today. Let me know in the comments below some of your favourite term differences when it comes to moving. The house is coming together. You may have noticed that there are fewer boxes behind me. That's because we've opened them/thrown some away. And Studio 81 is nearly complete, so I'll be able to move in there very soon. To discover more of my words, follow me on Twitter at LostInThePondUS, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that my videos don't get lost in the pond. A hammer-sized shout out to all of my patrons who make these videos possible. If you would like to become a patron of Lost in the Pond, you can do so at patreon.com/lostinthepond. Anyone who becomes a patron of my channel will get access to my secret live stream, and if you pledge $5 or more a month, you'll get not just that, but access to secret videos and a secret podcast. So until next time, I bid you adieu. Goodbye.